than the constitutional state and democracy. Toleration is regarded as a necessary component of democracy. Think of John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, his letter concerning toleration, both published at the same time, and think of the Glorious Revolution and the Toleration Act of William III, all of which, the publication of these books and these political events fall into the same year, 1688, 1689. If we look a little closer, however, at the relation between toleration and democracy, can you actually hear me well? Is this okay? If you look closer, things appear a little different. For a century later after Locke, at the very moment when social and political relations were being fundamentally transformed by the American and French revolutions, we find Immanuel Kant, for example, saying in 1784 that the name of tolerance is an arrogant one. In the debates over the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in the French National Assembly in 1789, Mirabeau declares that the concept of toleration smacks of tyranny because it involves the power to grant or withhold freedom of religion. In The Rights of Man, Thomas Paine likewise describes toleration as the counterfeit of intolerance and as no less despotic than the latter. And finally, Goethe, well, since I come from Goethe University, I always include a Goethe quote, whether you get a salary raise if you have enough. And since this is taped, I thought this is a good occasion. I can show it back home. So I put these in whenever they fit or not, but this one fits actually. Goethe says the following: tolerance should be a temporary attitude only. It must lead to recognition. To tolerate means to insult. So toleration suddenly, if we look at that, finds itself in conflict with democracy. It seems to belong to a pre-democratic and absolutist era. Conversely, however, the numerous political religious conflicts from the modern period up to the present demonstrate that a pluralist democracy in which different conceptions of the good and the just confront each other cannot get by without toleration. The ambivalence of toleration that becomes apparent here, it's in tension with democracy, but it seems essential to democracy. That ambivalence, I think, is no accident. It's rather a distinguishing feature of the concept of toleration. It remains a matter of controversy, not only where the limits of toleration should be drawn, that always is a matter of controversy, but also what toleration actually means and whether toleration is a good thing in a democracy. I want to cite a few examples from recent German politics to show this ambivalence of the concept and how contested it is. But I think that these are drawn from the German context doesn't mean they are unique to Germany. Well, there's always something unique about examples from a particular political context, but also something travels, and similar debates exist in other countries. The so-called crucifix decision of the German Federal Constitutional Court in 1995, so it's a while ago, but it's still an important event, became the focus of still ongoing disputes over whether it is intolerant to hang crucifixes or crosses by law in public schools, or whether instead the objections against this practice are a sign of anti-religious intolerance. In the context of the the so-called headscarf conflicts in Germany, it is asserted that it is intolerant to prohibit a Muslim teacher from wearing a headscarf, as has been done in most of the German states. While it is objected to this, that this very headscarf is a symbol of unfreedom and intolerance and therefore should not be tolerated, at least not with teachers. And I will come back to these examples later. While the proponents of the law on so-called registered lifelong partnerships for same-sex couples, that's how it was called in Germany's lifelong same-sex, partnerships, it wasn't called marriage. While the proponents of that law regarded its critics as highly intolerant, the critics of that law, and I understand that this is an issue very timely here, as the US Supreme Court had just a hearing on on the issues of same-sex marriage. The critics of that institution then responded with the motto, "Toleration, yes, marriage, no." That was a quote from, some official statements. But this kind of toleration, in particular, was rejected by the supporters of the law for a form of same-sex marriage. Now, if you look at these debates, you could say, okay, this concept of toleration is so highly contested and disputed, so we better close the books on it. It's really not useful anymore, because each party in such debates seems to be able to use it for its own purposes. But maybe we should take a second look. Maybe there's more about toleration we can learn, not just about the concept, the history, but also about why these conflicts are structured the way they are. So that's what I want to propose in this lecture. I want to start from a conceptual consideration of what toleration means, then point to a few problems inherent in that concept, then point to two conceptions that have historically developed, and then come back to this example and confuse you even more. I will try and flag the essential things that you should note on the way. Quite often people say there are various concepts of toleration when we see such conflicts about it. I don't think that's a proper way of speaking. I think there's only one concept of toleration, but various conceptions of it. Now, you might think that's hair splitting, but I think it is still important that these various conceptions are still united in a certain core of the concept. The concept of toleration really consists of three components, and I call these the components of objection, acceptance, and rejection. So if I had a PowerPoint, as old-fashioned dinosaur German professor, I don't, you would find these three words on them. But then again, it's a bit embarrassing to have a PowerPoint with only three words. So objection, acceptance, rejection. Why objection? When do we speak the language of toleration? Only where we have an objection against certain beliefs or practices of other people. When you walk out of this room and say, okay, most of the things he said we could tolerate, but a few were completely impossible, then that's not a good thing for me. When we say we tolerate the beliefs of a friend, we say, he's a good guy, but these beliefs are a problem. When we say we tolerate certain practices, we pass a negative judgment on them. So what the objects of our toleration are regarded as being problematic, sometimes false, bad. If you encounter other beliefs and practices which you find different from yours, but you have no problem with them, but you actually think they're interesting, then you can never be tolerant about them. I'm sorry, you're just happy. If you have no opinion about them, you're indifferent, you can't be tolerant either, because it just doesn't matter to you what they think or do. Very often, toleration is confused or seen as an attitude of indifference. But very little conceptual thinking shows you that this cannot be true. If you're indifferent, you don't tolerate something. You only tolerate what you think is wrong, at least in important ways. There's the second component, that of acceptance. There must be reason why the things, the beliefs or practices that you think are problematic should nevertheless be tolerated. So that's a set of positive reasons. The thing about toleration is that these positive reasons do not eradicate the negative reasons. They just stand next to them, and in a case of toleration, trump the negative reasons. But you are still aware of the negative reasons. You know what you think is wrong or problematic about what you tolerate, but you know why it nevertheless should be tolerated. Until, and that's the third component, another set of reasons comes into play, again negative, and that's what I call the rejection component. And in this terminology, I'm indebted to Preston King, so it's not that it's only me who thought of these nice things. So the rejection component marks the limits of toleration. You find something problematic, you still tolerate it for certain reasons until a point where the limits of toleration are reached. So this negative judgment is in a way stronger than the first, because the first tells you that something's wrong with what they do or think, but the second judgment tells you that something is so wrong about what they do or think that it ought not to be tolerated. So we're dealing with three kinds of reasons: objection, acceptance, and rejection. And the analysis so far does not imply the nature of these reasons. They could all be of a religious kind. You think the other religion is false, you think out of an attitude of charity or other religious considerations they should be tolerated up until a point where, say, blasphemy is reached. So that's a typical religious way of grounding these. You could have other grounds, like, say, human rights considerations which mark the limits of toleration. The concept of toleration itself does not determine these reasons and where they come from. Now, to make things a little more complicated, but really not too complicated, it's just by way of illuminating these components. Each of these components has a certain paradoxical character. The first component, the objection component, is confronted with what I call the paradox of the tolerant racist. According to this paradox, someone who rejects other human beings generally because of what he or she regards as their race would be all the more tolerant the stronger this rejection was, or this objection, provided that he refrains from acting in the way implied by his negative judgment, say for strategic reasons. But would we really want to ascribe the virtue of tolerance, assuming that tolerance is a virtue, to such a person who has deep-seated racist beliefs but just doesn't act on them? So are we comfortable with saying that this is a tolerant person? So this sheds light on the issue of what reasons of objection that someone holds are actually good reasons, and what the criteria for the set of reasons of objection actually should be, and whether racist stereotypes, for example, should be regarded as proper reasons for objection. I'll come back to this issue of toleration and racism. The second component of acceptance is haunted by another paradox. And that's simply the question, how can it be morally right to tolerate what is morally wrong? Assuming we find some practices morally wrong, how can we ever tolerate them with an argument that says that it is morally right, or maybe even obligatory, to tolerate them? That seems to be clearly paradoxical. There's a third paradox connected with the third component, that of objection. It's the paradox of drawing the limits. It seems that every act of drawing the boundaries of toleration between those who are within the realm of the tolerable and those who are not is at the same time an act of intolerance, because for those especially who are then regarded as intolerable, from their perspective, that seems just an arbitrary drawing of the limits and a clear sign of intolerance. So that means every form of tolerance which has certain limits is regarded as a form of intolerance because it has these and such limits. Now, I will, in the next step, explain two different conceptions of toleration, which then might help us to understand some of the examples I've been giving you, and I will also, in the end, present an argument why these paradoxes that I just briefly named are not so paradoxical, or at least that there is a way to iron them out. So far, however, keep in mind that everything I said about toleration presupposes that the resources to substantiate, to make an attitude of toleration work, come from other sources: religious sources, moral sources, strategic considerations. The concept of toleration itself is what I call a normatively dependent concept. For it to have substance, bite, content, other normative resources need to be in play. So toleration is not an independent virtue, and sometimes it's not a virtue at all. If you tolerate things you should not tolerate, it's not a virtue. So it's a very dependent form of action and of a normative relation towards others. Now, I distinguish two conceptions of toleration. They have historically developed. And of course, when we embark on an analysis, a philosophical analysis of toleration, we have to keep in mind that we're dealing here with a thick historical concept. It goes back a long way, and much longer than we think, which is why the book I wrote about this, that Bill was so kind to mention, is such an impossibly long book. Originally, I had thought, you know, early modernity and a few figures need to be reconstructed, and then you focus on contemporary societies. But it turned out to be impossible to do it that way, because the history of toleration is much older than early modernity, and in fact, the most important arguments for toleration, like freedom of conscience and many others, have been developed in early Roman and Christian times and have been reproduced and also changed to some extent. So we need to go back a long way. So I won't take you back all the way. Just historically, there is an important conception and understanding of toleration that I call the permission conception. Permission. On this conception, an authority grants one or several minorities the permission to live in accordance with their convictions, which are described as defiant and problematic, provided that these minorities do not challenge the supremacy, the authority. The difference of the minorities is supposed to remain a private matter, mostly, confined within a narrowly circumscribed and clearly defined framework laid down unilaterally by the side that wields power. Toleration is something bestowed and can be revoked at any time if the minorities violate certain conditions. All three components then, objection, acceptance, and rejection, are defined, spelled out, and put into practice by the authority that grants the permission. They define what's wrong with a minority, why they can nevertheless be tolerated, up to which point. That's just what, in most cases, monarchical authority decides. So a classic case are the historical toleration acts or the edicts of toleration, like the Edict of Nantes from 1598, one of the most famous regulations of toleration, where Henri IV says the following, quote, "Not to leave any occasion of trouble and difference among our subjects, we have permitted and do permit to those of the Reformed religion," which is the Huguenots, "to live and dwell in all the cities and places of this our kingdom and countries under our obedience, without being inquired after, vexed, molested, or compelled to do anything in religion contrary to their conscience," end of quote. So you see the permission language, it is permitted to these minorities what they can do, and it's precisely, mostly in these regulations, precisely defined which minorities, what they can do, up to what point, and so on. If you look at, for example, how in certain of these laws, it is laid down whether the minority religion can have churches, whether the churches can have towers, whether in that towers there can be bells, whether there can be an entrance from the main street, and so on. Someone who knows about the debates about where and how mosques can be built in European societies just feels as if you have been thrown back 400 years. It's the same thing. The ambivalence of this kind of toleration becomes apparent, whereas on the one hand, it grants minorities a certain security and certain liberties. On the other hand, it's a continuation of domination by other means. Because the tolerated minorities must pay for their liberties and their protection with obedience and loyalty. And the history of the Jews as a tolerated minority in Christian societies in Europe is a long history about having such a precarious state of toleration, which of course is much better than being expelled, but there was a high price to be paid, sometimes in money, but also in terms of stigmatization and being second-class or third-class citizens. So such a policy of permission toleration is actually a very good policy of disciplining minorities by granting them some freedom, because they are dependent on the very authority that gives them these freedoms, and they have to live an extremely loyal and disciplined life. So that is why Kant, Goethe, Mirabeau, and Paine think that there's something wrong with toleration, because it has that hierarchical structure of dominating minorities, even though they are not persecuted. But they live in a sheltered space, but it's a precarious space. Now, the second conception of toleration is not hierarchical in that form. It's vertical. It's a democratic conception of toleration. It also developed historically in contexts of early modernity, in the Netherlands, in England, finally in America and France. The idea here is that toleration is a stance adopted by citizens toward each other, not by an authority towards minorities, but by citizens toward each other who are simultaneously tolerating and tolerated, as subjected to and as authorizing the law that binds them all. Even though they have sharply divergent conceptions of the good and of salvation, as the case may be, they grant each other the status of citizens endowed with equal rights, which states that the basic structure of political and social life common to all should be founded only on those norms that can meet with the equal acceptance of all citizens. The authority to bestow liberty now no longer resides exclusively in a power center, but in a process of legitimation or justification that between equals, roughly, at least legally equals, that must not violate certain basic rights. Now, you could say that's fine, sounds good, but now, since we live in democratic constitutional states, why tell this old story about these outdated monarchical, hierarchical form of toleration? Now, see, as many of you who are historians or deal with history know, there's always some progress made, but it comes with, often with a shadow. And so it is here too that in democratic states, the permission conception reappears, but now in a majoritarian form. Now it is democratic majorities which define what minorities can do up to what point. And this is, I think, what explains the rivalry between a permission understanding of toleration and a respect understanding of toleration in our time, in the conflicts of our societies. So come back to the crucifix example. Here, the advocates of a permission conception of toleration took the view that although religious minorities should be granted freedom from coercion and freedom of conscience in principle, there was no obligation to grant them legal and political equality such that their objection could have had the effect of preventing the Christian majority among the citizenry from expressing, as it was called in German legal language, their positive religious freedom by affixing their symbols by law in the classrooms of